When you get excited about something, do you allow yourself to move ahead? Do you allow yourself to do what you feel called to do? Or do you hold yourself back based on the ideas in your head? You're listening to Pure Light, where we explore how you can believe in yourself and be happy with who you are so that you feel worthy of your craziest dreams and confident in your power to make them happen. My name is Ailey. I'm a coach, writer, and Kundalini Yoga and meditation teacher. This is episode 92, and it's about permission. So a couple of episodes ago, and I can't remember exactly which one it was in right now. Maybe it was more than a couple, actually. But I told a story that I've told on here before about how I was up for a promotion and I didn't get it. And it had a different point than when I had talked about that previously. But I felt weird about telling that story again because I feel like I've exhausted that story in a way. And at the same time, there was so much that I learned out of that story that I'm sure that there's even more that I could talk about. But when I went to record that episode, I was kind of like, why am I telling this story again? And it was weird because it felt like I shouldn't be telling that story again. I shouldn't be saying the same thing. And so I had that feeling like maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And I started to think about where that idea came from, that I shouldn't repeat myself. And I actually came up with something. So I used to read Leo Babota's blog about 10 years ago. I was really into it. His work is amazing. If you aren't familiar with it, his blog is zenhabits.net, and he writes about how to change your habits and mindfulness and simplicity. And the themes and ideas that are in his work show up regularly. And I remember at one point earlier on in his blog, he talked about how he was criticized for that. And, you know, the criticism was something along the lines of like, you've already said this. Why don't you tell me something I don't know? And I think it's common for the mind to have an automatic reaction to things that's like that, you know, where it's like, I already know this. And then the mind will kind of dismiss or not pay attention to the rest of the stuff that follows, which may be something for me to talk about in a future episode. But anyway, at the time that I read that, I remember thinking that's really interesting that Leo got this feedback because I always find value in his work, even if he's saying something I've heard him talk about before. And in addition to Leo, I've heard several other people talk about the same things. So Cheryl Strayed has talked about the loss of her mother several times. And I've even heard her say something about how people must be sick of hearing her talk about that. But I personally haven't been, but you know, maybe there are people who are, who knows. I've also heard Kyle Cease share a couple of things over and over. So there's one story about a client that he was working with that I've heard multiple times. Like I think I heard it during an online event. I think I heard it during an in-person event. And then it was also in his latest book. And so he's also told the same stories or used the same examples a couple times. And then Mastin Kipp is another one. So I remember a number of years ago, he had a couple of events in Toronto and I went to a few of them. And I remember being so surprised because he shared something that he had shared during an online event. And I somehow went into the event assuming that whatever he shared would be new. And at that event, I also remember him talking about how it doesn't matter what you know until you take action. And it's true. We often look for new ideas to fix our problems. But new ideas aren't necessarily better ideas. It's the integration of ideas that matters. Because it doesn't matter if you know something if you aren't operating based on it. It's only when something is integrated in your awareness that it actually informs how you show up in the world. And it usually takes conscious intention and attention for that to happen. So knowing something doesn't magically change the way that you behave. And that's something that I see in my work with clients too. Because we may know that we want to change our behavior, but actually changing it requires some attention. And it isn't just about aligning things externally, like your schedule or your environment or your circumstances. It's also about aligning things internally, like your thoughts and your beliefs and your emotions. So if you're used to thinking about things in a certain way, it takes practice to change that pattern. You have to keep choosing the new pattern or the new perspective whenever you catch yourself going back to the old one until that new one becomes the new default, the new pattern. And one of the things I remember from when I used to do training in the corporate world is that you have to tell people things 3 times just to get it to sink in. So not even to get them to operate by that idea, but just for them to have an awareness and an understanding of it, and even just to remember it after the training. So repetition of ideas and stories isn't a bad thing. It's actually preferable because repeated exposure helps with integration. And so speaking about that, when I went to the event with Steven Pressfield earlier this year, I wanted to get the most out of it. So I figured the best way to do that was to reread one of his books, The Artist's Journey, because I knew that the event was going to be based on that. So I read that. And I also listened to the conversation that he had with Oprah on Super Soul Sunday. And I felt really good because I felt like, ooh, I'm prepared. I'm going to get the most out of this. And then when he started talking at the event, I realized this pretty quickly. I realized I wasn't going to hear anything new. I realized he was restating some of the same things that I'd heard him say. And I was actually really excited about that because rather than being like, oh my God, I've heard this, I was like, wow, I'm so lucky. I get to hear him say this in person because I knew that hearing those ideas from him again would help them sink in at a deeper level. And at the same time, I felt a sense of relief because I think before that, I really felt like I needed to not repeat myself. And him repeating himself made me realize that I don't need to hold myself to that constraint that I shouldn't repeat myself. So this made me realize that it's not only okay for me to repeat myself, like in terms of stories and ideas, it's actually preferable. It's good for anyone listening because the repetition will help with integration. And it's good for me personally because it means I get to follow my creative impulses without holding myself to that constraint that I shouldn't repeat myself. And actually, last week, I did that because I felt the need to revisit fear of judgment, which I've talked about at least twice before. And rather than talking myself out of it because I was like, oh, I've talked about this before, I was like, I'm just going to go with it and see what happens. And I really liked how that episode came out because it went deeper into the mental projections associated with that. So there were parallels between that episode and the previous ones. And I shared more details about something that I had talked about in one of the previous episodes. And I repeated some of the ideas I'd already shared, but there was still value in me doing that. It not only allowed me to follow that creative impulse, it also allowed me to build on what I'd said before. And also, different things resonate with different people. So there can be a lot of value even just in saying the same thing in a different way. So the constraints that we hold ourselves to are based on the ideas we have about how things should be. When you don't feel like you have permission to do the things that you feel called to do, it's a sign that there's a belief there that's holding you back. And that belief often has the word should in it. So something like, I should be doing this, or I shouldn't be doing this. But regardless of what it sounds like, that belief is just an idea in your head. And like all ideas in your head, it may or may not be true. So it's worth questioning those ideas when they come up and asking yourself, like, what constraints have I been placing on myself? Are they serving me, or is it time to let them go? And what would it feel like if I gave myself permission to do that? I think that's probably the most important question because that's the one that prioritizes your inner experience. It's the one that creates space for more freedom and excitement and expansion. When you allow yourself to do the things that you feel called to do, you become more fully yourself. There's more to come on this topic, so stay tuned. I'm actually going to challenge myself to say the same thing different ways multiple times because this is so fundamental to the bigger idea of letting go of who you think you're supposed to be. So if you want to hear that, subscribe to Pure Light wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, may you be guided by your light.